Hello, I'm Carolyn Judge and I'm a watercolour artist. I live in Auckland in New Zealand and I'm going to be running a series of tutorials from my studio in my home. I hope that you'll join me as I cover off all aspects of learning watercolour painting, really from the very beginning, and then getting into some pretty complex paintings later on. About 12 years ago I retired from the IT industry and I decided to take up being a watercolour artist full-time. It's been quite a long journey over those 12 years. I've probably spent 15,000 hours practicing, but it's paid off because recently at one of New Zealand's biggest art shows I won the Ray Hannum Memorial Trophy for the best watercolour in the show. That's a coveted trophy, a coveted prize, prestigious to win in New Zealand, and you can only win it once in your lifetime. So I feel like it validated all those hours I've spent in my studio. I sell my work through my website, carolynjudge.com, various other websites as well. I sell my work through shops in New Zealand, and I sell prints also available on my website, also through shops. I enter my work in exhibitions and competitions across New Zealand, but also internationally. This video I shall refer to as my introduction video. I'll describe the materials that I use, and in later tutorials I might refer in general terms to some materials, but you'll be able to replay this video and refresh your memory of what it is I use. I don't have a big range of brushes. I tend to use these mop head brushes. These are sable. These are expensive brushes. I've invested in a few expensive brushes. These are, this is a Da Vinci brush and this one is an Isobe. They're both size 4. I love these two brushes and I use them all the time. They're very versatile and they hold lots of water. You need a brush that can hold a lot of water. Synthetic brushes also work very well. I also love this brush. This is a Da Vinci brush. It's a Casa Neo, but it's got a cat's tongue end. And I love that too. When it's wet, it takes on a shape that makes it very versatile for getting into tight spaces. But I also work with finer brushes for detail. These Da Vinci brushes, this is a number 5. It's got a very fine point on it. Put that plastic sleeve on when the head is wet. Keeps it a nice fine point. Once that point splits, the brush is really ruined, and then I might use it for some acrylic work that I sometimes do. My watercolour brushes are kept very much just for watercolour, and they're my prized possessions. I really respect my brushes. They're an expensive item, so I take good care of them. I have got some cheap synthetics. This is another Da Vinci brush. It's a flat head. I sometimes use it. I think it cost only $2 or $3. And then various other sizes, right down to some very fine Isobe number 3 brush for that very fine detail. Maybe when I'm painting something like an eye on a portrait, I'll use something very detailed like this. So Da Vinci and Isobe brushes are my preferred brushes. Typically, I've worked with Fabriano 300 GSM hot press paper. Hot press paper is what I would describe as very fast paper. It's got no tooth. It's got no texture to it. It's a very pure flat paper. I call it fast because when you put your watercolour paints on it, the paint and the water moves very fast across it. If you use cold press paper or rough paper, it's got thousands of dimples in it to give it its tooth, and it slows the movement of the water and the paint down. But I learned to paint on hot press paper, And I think that if you can learn to control your watercolor paints on hot press paper, then the rest of it's so easy. So I encourage you to learn on 300 GSM hot press paper. Fabriano is a great brand of paper, but Arches also does a very good paper. Recently I switched to 600 GSM paper and I've been loving that. I've also tried to vary the type of paper that I use. I also still use hot press paper, but depending on my subjects, I also use cold press and rough paper. The paints that I use, I'm very particular about. I've tried just about every brand, and there are a few favourites that I've settled on that I'll stick with. The two brands that I love, firstly is Schminke. They're a German brand. Their paint quality is excellent. And I always buy my paints in these big 15mm tubes. I find that's very cost effective. And their colour range is superb. Schminke does magnificent transparent watercolours. The other brand I love is Daniel Smith. I particularly love Daniel Smith paints for their opaques and their grainy paints. But really, you can't go wrong with either brand. And I highly recommend, especially when you're starting out, to invest in some good quality paints. Whatever brand of paint you decide to end up working with, my advice is to get to know your paints. Daniel Smith or Schminke, they put out brochures about their paints. And they'll tell you all the colour range that they provide. But they also tell you its light fastness, whether it's grainy, whether it's opaque. These are important things to know. Some pigments are very staining. The cadmium colours are very staining. Other colours are not staining at all and could fade out, and it's important to understand that. It's also important to know which paints are grainy. A lot of watercolour painting is about building up your layers of paint. And if you're going to do that, then you really want to be working with transparents. If you start building up your layers of paint with something very grainy, like a cobalt blue, you'll find that when you put subsequent layers on top, you'll disrupt the grain that's underneath. Building layers really needs to be done with transparents. And these brochures that your supplier should be able to provide you with will tell you what paints are transparent. Get to know the difference between transparents, opaques and grainy paints. It's very important. It's a very important part of watercolour painting. I work with quite a limited range of watercolour colours. I have probably 20 paints that I use, and they range from transparents to grainy paints to opaques, and there are warm and cool colours in each colour. But with those 20 paints I can paint any texture that I want, any shade, any warmth that I want, and I can mix any colour at all from those. When I teach watercolour painting, it's always a surprise to me that my students might follow my instruction, but because they're using cheap materials, their results are quite different to mine. So if you're serious about watercolour painting, invest in good paints and good brushes and good quality paper. You won't regret it. You can spend hours, maybe hundreds of hours, with cheap materials, and eventually you might give up because you're disheartened at your results. The palette that I use is a large palette. Its brand is called Creative Mark. It's got quite a few wells to hold my paints, and it's got 4 big mixing wells. Again, I bought this from jerrysartorama.com in the States. It was very cheap, but I love it. I wouldn't want a palette any bigger than this, because when I'm working at my workbench in my studio, if my palette was any bigger, I wouldn't have space to have my big full sheet of paper. Let's talk about how to get started with a painting. It's not just a simple question of picking up a brush, dipping it in some water, into some paint and onto your paper. It takes a little bit of planning to come up with a good painting. Depends on the subject that you might want to paint, and it depends on the style of painting you want to end up with as to whether you'd make a drawing and how you make your drawing. If your style of watercolor painting is going to be very loose and flowing, you may not want to do a drawing at all. You may want to be entirely spontaneous about the way watercolor behaves. But if you want to paint a lot of detail, you might want to make a drawing. And if you want to be precise, let's say you're painting a portrait, a person's face, I would recommend that you do make a drawing, and I would recommend that you put as much detail into your drawing as you can. It would be a pity to spend such a long time on your painting to find that one of the eyes wasn't quite properly positioned. There's something to be said for spontaneity, but if you end up with a portrait that doesn't look right, then your time might be wasted. So what I'd say is that if you're going to do something loose, don't do a drawing at all. This is a painting that I did on 300 GSM cold press arch paper. And this is a painting that I did with no drawing at all. I used a reference photograph, and I started in the middle and I worked my way out. I wanted it to be as realistic but as loose as possible, and I'm very pleased with the result. If I had tried drawing every little colour change section, I think it would have become a little bit confusing, and I think I would have lost some of the spontaneity that I got when I painted this. So that's what can be achieved with no drawing. This is another painting that I did. This is on 600 GSM arch paper. You can tell it's very thick, feels very different. This is a painting of a orangutan mother and her baby. I wanted the fur to be impressionistic, spontaneous. I wanted it to show texture, which I think I got, and that's one of the reasons why I used cold press paper. For the orangutans themselves, I did as little drawing as I could. I didn't do any drawing through this area, no drawing for the fur, but I did draw in detail the faces. And you can see that it's nice to have detail and then looseness. I think that works well. I think it's good to mix it up. If I'd drawn every piece of fur in, I would have lost something. And if I hadn't have drawn in the details and captured that detail with my paintbrush, again, I would have lost something. But I'm happy with the way that turned out. This again is another quite tight painting that I did. I wanted it to be tight. I did that intentionally. I wanted the detail in these flowers to be seen. This again is painted on 600 GSM hot press paper. See all the lovely warm colours I got, but you can see the contrast between some warm and cools in there. You can see temperature change between the petals, and you can see the detail right down to the individual petal. And then these little buds here have got detail. I got that detail by making a detailed drawing. The background is loose and spontaneous, so again it's a nice mix, it's a nice blend. And then this painting, again painted on 600 GSM hot press paper. This turtle is painted over this watery background, which was completely spontaneous. And the turtle itself was done without a drawing, except for positioning his flippers. And I wanted to, again, draw in the face. I wanted detail in the face. If I'd not drawn the turtle at all, I may not have captured all that detail, and that would have been a shame. So for me, drawing is an important part of the process. But if I want something loose and spontaneous, I don't make a drawing at all. I think one of the hardest things when you're starting out is to find your style. If you want to be impressionistic, if you want to paint with such detail that you want to stop people in their tracks to say, how did she do that? Or I wonder what medium that's been painted with. That was one of my goals at the beginning 12 years ago, was to not necessarily show people that I've painted with watercolour. I wanted to show that I could paint any subject, any style. And I achieved that. And I'm proud that I achieved that. But now I feel like I've gone full circle, and I want to bring lots of spontaneity back into my work. This is one of the reasons I have become less fussy with my drawings. I try to let the painting speak for itself. If I'm painting something like a flower or a tree or the sky, I wouldn't make a drawing. But a human portrait or an animal, then I would invest in the drawing. So in terms of getting started on a painting, let's look at some reference material. Some people like to go out in the field and paint en plein air, painting out in the field, surrounded by nature, painting what they see. I admire people that do that. I don't do that, and I've never really had a desire to do it, although it might be something I'll do in the future. What I like is to work in the comfort and isolation of my studio, where it's peaceful and the light is good. I like to work from reference photographs. More often than not, those photographs are ones that myself or my husband have taken. We travel quite a lot, and we usually have some form of camera with us. So we're always snapping shots to use for my painting. But if there's something specific like that I want, like, well, birds are a typical subject, very, very hard to photograph yourself. You need to invest in a good camera, a big lens, and then you have to sit in a bush or somewhere waiting for the bird to come for hours on end. I don't want to do that. I don't want to take my photography that seriously. But if I want to paint a bird, what I will do is buy the image. Or I'll find a place on the internet that sells copyright-free images. You can't just go and use somebody else's image. You certainly have to ask their permission at a minimum. But most photographers will expect either permission to be sought or they'll expect a payment. And I respect that. I respect copyright law. So images that I don't want to set up myself or feel like I couldn't do justice photographing with my own camera, like this Rambling Rose picture, I saw that on the internet and I was so taken with it. I thought it was a beautiful composition, and you might remember the painting I made from it. It came out so well because I had a good photograph to start with, and I wanted to emulate that photograph. I didn't want to put my own interpretation on that because I loved the image to begin with. So one of the places where I buy my images from is a website called Dreams Time. And you be aware of copyright law, especially if you're going to be entering your paintings into competitions or into art exhibitions. You will be signing a disclaimer on your entry form that says that your image is copyright free, that the image is all your own work. So let's look at a few images and talk about how we might paint them. This underwater scene of a moray eel, that's an image that appeals to me. This imagery around the eel could be completely spontaneous with watercolor. It could just be splashes and flashes of color, completely unplanned, all within a lovely blue ocean. And then I might paint the moray eel in detail. Or I might take another underwater scene and make it a bigger image, a wider image. And I might just put that moray eel into that scene. Of course, when you start combining reference photos, you need to make sure that the sizes are all compatible. If I was to put that eel into that underwater scene, I would need to either size that one up or size that one down. But underwater scenes can be very loose, very spontaneous. This is another image that I bought from the internet. This is a sort of image that I would not paint spontaneously. For me, what's lovely about this image is the detail. It's the detail of the trunk. It's the detail of the calf. So I would paint those elephants as they are in that photograph, and I would put as much detail in as possible, and I would get my drawing as accurate as possible. But I wouldn't necessarily use that background. I recently painted this and I put a completely spontaneous, abstract background behind it, and it worked very well. What size to make your drawing is also another thing to consider. Elephants are big, and to have painted that size, A4, may not have done those elephants justice. So I sometimes size my images up, make that an A3, and that's still, I said earlier when I talked about paper, how I buy my paper in full sheets, and that's really an A2 size. So A4, A3, and then a full sheet of paper is A2. So you could always double the size of that again and make a really big painting. It would be quite stunning. I always ask myself, what colours am I going to use? Am I going to use the true colours in my reference photograph, or am I going to completely make them up? If you're going to paint something like a turtle, you could just paint it any colour. Everyone knows it's a turtle. It doesn't have to be those colours. I ask myself, where are the shadows and where is the light? Light and shadows are really how we create form with our watercolour, how we determine that something has shape. I always look for that in a painting. This turtle painting, probably because it's underwater, doesn't really have a lot of shadow on it, so it's very hard to know just that underneath the shell is darker than this area on the top. Well, I would probably embellish that if I was to do a painting of this. I would probably make the shell much lighter than you see here, and perhaps I would make the underneath area much darker. Always looking for contrasting colours and light. I ask myself also, is there some movement in the painting? I like to see movement. One of the reasons why I like this image is because you can see that the elephant's walking along. I like that. I also like painting images where the image is moving very fast, like a bird in flight, and create some sort of blurred section to the bird. Maybe the ends of the wings are blurred out to give a sense of movement. And then I ask myself about the temperature of the painting. Do I want it to be a warm or a cool painting, or do I want some of the subjects to be warm and others to be cool? This painting I did of the Rambling Rose, it's a very warm painting when you first look at it, but then this has got blues and purples, which are actually quite cool colours. Quite cool colours around here and here. That purple that I've used is almost grey in places. Quite cool. But then I've got very, very warm colours. Very, very warm through here. Very good temperature changes. And that's one of the reasons why this image works well. And then even with my background, I've got some real warm spots. But then I've faded out almost to white paper to give some coldness to it. It's good to mix up those colour temperatures. So ask yourself about the size of your image, the style, drawing or no drawing, the movement, the temperature. Lots of questions to ask before you get started. Try to have a vision in your mind of how you want it to end up looking. It'll help you. So let's talk about drawing. Not so much about how to draw. There's lots of tutorials online, I'm sure, about that. But more precisely, how to get your image onto watercolor paper. Now, of course, if you're an excellent artist, that's no trouble at all. But what if you're not very good at drawing? I've found that not many tutorials out there ever cover this particular subject, almost like it's assumed that everybody can draw. Well, I for one can't. When I started painting full-time 12 years ago, I was very dismal at drawing. I tried very hard, but it just didn't come naturally to me. Of course, over the years, I've practiced a lot. And I've got better. You can learn it and you can improve. It's not all about natural ability. If you're using 300 GSM paper or lighter, have your reference material the size that you want to actually have it in your finished painting. Hold it up to a window and put your watercolor paper over the top, and you'll probably be able to see your image through it. And then you can just transfer your image onto the paper. Whenever I use 300 GSM paper, I always stretch my paper. And that's a critical process, in my opinion, about using 300 GSM or lighter paper. So if you've stretched your paper, how do you then hold your paper up to the light? Well, do your drawing first, and then you can soak your paper, and then you can stretch it. If for some reason that's not working for you, maybe your reference material is not contrasty enough, you can't see it through the paper, then there's another way of doing it, and that's by using a light box. This is my light box. It's called Artograph. It's a light pad A930. I bought it in New Zealand for about $350, and I've used it a lot over the years. I don't use it so much now because my drawing has improved quite a lot, and I also try to be a little bit more spontaneous with my drawing, but this has been a great aid for me. And the way you use it, preferably you use it at night time when it's quite dark, but you put your image, whether it's a photograph or a photocopy, it doesn't really matter, the light will come up through a photograph as well. You put your 300 GSM paper over the top and you can see enough detail to make your drawing. Now you may not be able to see a lot of detail here because it's daytime, but you can see if I create some shadow that you can really see a lot of detail. I should get a similar amount of transparency through your watercolor paper if you hold it up to the window, especially if it's quite a bright sunny day. But what if you've stretched your paper onto a board, or you want to use some thick paper like this 600 GSM paper? We put our image on the light box and then put our 600 GSM paper over the top. Now you don't really see a lot of detail. If I was going to draw something quite complex, that wouldn't be enough detail for me to see even at night time. So the way that I transfer a drawing when I can't see through the paper is to use tracing paper. It's still quite a simple method. Takes a little bit of practice though. And what I do is I trace the image onto tracing paper, and again you can use the light box to make your tracing. For me, I only have to trace the outline of the image to have enough to then be able to go on to draw the whole image. On this particular image, what I wanted to capture was this the whole outline of the image, including the rosebuds, but then some key points like these petals here are the petals that come over the center of the rose, and these ones here, again, they come over the center. So I wanted to capture those, and by capturing just key areas, it's enough for me to then be able to transfer these lines onto my paper, and then I can fill the rest in just by looking at the image. So you've got your traced lines. To get those onto your paper now, the way to do it, the way I do it, is to hold firmly onto this piece of paper so that it doesn't move around, or you can just make a little marker here to say, okay, that's the corner of the tracing paper there, and then if it moves out of place you can always come back to that exact point again. But I hold one corner down, and then I just use my pencil underneath the tracing paper while I'm holding it, and I use it as a guide to see where the lines are. It's not perfect, but certainly for drawing something like a flower, it's good enough. But this is a good enough way for me to be able to make a good drawing of this rambling rose. I won't draw the whole thing now, but you can see, you know, I'm beginning to get enough detail. When I've drawn all the lines, I'll then be able to have a look at my reference image and say, okay, well, I can see that there's a petal that comes out there, so I'll just draw that in, and then I can see that there's another petal that comes out here, and so on. And it really sort of becomes sort of a joining the dots sort of drawing then. But you're still getting a bit of freehand drawing in there, which is good because that's your mark. You know, your freehand drawing is your sort of personal stamp on the finished painting. So that's how I transfer my images, and it works really well when you're trying to draw something quite complex like this elephant. You know, you want to make sure that you get the eyes in the right place and that the trunk is the right length. And by taking a tracing of it first and then moving it across in this method, you'll end up with a good drawing. I hope that's been helpful for you. What I'd say about choosing the image that you're going to paint is to choose it carefully. Some images are really hard to paint with watercolor. Very light images surrounded by very dark colors are hard to paint. Try to get into the habit of using transparent paints and building up layers. You'll find that it's a little less nerve-wracking when you're beginning to build up one layer of colour at a time rather than trying to create a painting all in one big, wet, messy approach. Take it one layer at a time. For now, you might want to start with a simple image like this one. And this is what I'm going to be showing you in my first Paint Along With Me tutorial, a step-by-step approach to how you can paint this apple. We've got a couple of highlights here and some rich colour here, all showing that this has got good form, good use of colour. I started out learning to paint apples and I progressed on to portraits not that far afterwards. The theory's all the same. We'll be building up layers of colour. And it's a simple drawing for you to start with. We all know what an apple looks like. So you can make your drawing at home and then follow along with me through the step-by-step process. I hope you'll join me for that tutorial. I've been a watercolour artist for 12 years, full-time now, but before that I was an artist of some kind. I've been a glass artist, I've cast glass, I've been a glass blower, and I've worked with stained glass. I've also been a semi-professional potter. I had my own kiln and my own studio, and I used to sell to shops around New Zealand.